bitter, not fun to be around. Those words did not come from a tabloid enemy chasing a headline. They did not come from a palace aide with a political motive, or from a commentator desperate for attention. They came from people who were genuinely close to Harry, who knew him before the interviews, before the memoir, before California. People who knew the version of him that most of the world was reacting to when it gave him the extraordinary level of public warmth and goodwill he once carried.
He's been brainwashed by Meghan. Who could disagree? Since they got married, he suddenly hates his country, hates his family, hates being a royal, and goes off for a very boring life in California. This is not a marriage. This is a hostage situation.
And they came not at the beginning of a controversy, but at the end of a long period of watching and waiting and trying to see the old Harry through whatever was happening on the surface. That context matters enormously. These are not first impressions or hostile outsider observations shaped by agenda. They are conclusions reached after sustained proximity, after years of loyalty, after the kind of patience that eventually runs out when it has been extended repeatedly and not returned in kind. This week, another name was quietly added to the list. Peter Phillips, Princess Anne's son, 48 years old, preparing to marry Harriet Spurling in the Cotswolds this summer, will not be inviting his cousin. The confirmation came through Hello magazine in 2 words: lost touch. And in the language the royal world uses when it wants to say something without saying it directly, those 2 words carry significant weight. Tonight, we are going through the full picture. What the Peter Phillips decision represents, and why it carries specific weight beyond its surface simplicity.
I've said it so many times, but they're the architects of their own demise.
The growing list of relationships that appear to have cooled or ended entirely across a range of contexts that makes the pattern hard to explain as coincidence. What the cumulative picture says about where Harry finds himself in 2026, 5 years after the departure that was supposed to represent freedom and a new beginning, and the uncomfortable question that sits underneath all of it, the one that commentators have been circling for years and that now feels closer to the surface than ever, about what happens when the same outcome repeats itself across enough different parts of someone's life that the pattern becomes impossible to attribute to anything external. Let's start with Peter Phillips, because understanding who he is matters considerably more than almost anything else about this story. Let's start with Peter Phillips, because understanding who he is matters more than almost anything else in this story. Peter is not a controversial figure. He has never built a career around drama or headlines. He was raised by Princess Anne without a royal title, deliberately, as a choice that says something specific about the values the family wanted to instill in him. The idea that what you do matters more than what you are called. He built his own life quietly, on his own terms, without the palace machine managing his image or a title opening doors for him. He is known by the people who know him as private, grounded, and steady, someone who earns things rather than inheriting them. He is also someone with a thoroughly documented track record of loyalty during genuinely hard moments, the kind of moments that reveal character in a way that ordinary situations never do.
Not being there is truly shocking because Harry and Peter used to be very close, but like everybody previously close to Harry, the relationship is now over. We've seen that with Charles, we've seen that with William, we've seen that with Harry's best friends from his military times and when he was at...
When Diana died, he went to Balmoral to be with William and Harry. At Prince Philip's funeral, he walked between the 2 brothers at a moment of enormous and very public tension, not because protocol demanded it, but because the family trusted him to manage that specific emotional weight. He attended Harry and Meghan's wedding with what people who were there described as genuine goodwill. None of that is the record of someone reckless with relationships or quick to walk away from people he cares about. That history is what makes lost touch land with the weight it does. When someone with that track record, someone who has demonstrably shown up for Harry during some of the hardest moments of his life, arrives at a quiet 2-word conclusion, it is not a casual statement. It is the conclusion of a process. People close to how these things work in royal and aristocratic circles understand that decisions of this kind are not made quickly. They are made after doors have been tried, after patience has been extended, after the calculation has been run multiple times, and come out the same way. The fact that it was delivered through a magazine rather than through silence or drama tells you something too. There was no hostile public statement, no emotional interview, no attempt to score points, just two words, placed where they needed to be placed, carrying the specific weight that two words in that context from that person were always going to carry, deliberately underplayed, precisely because the understatement communicates more than any elaboration could. If Palace Insider is giving you the full picture that other channels skip, hit the like button. It helps the channel reach more people. Because Peter Phillips is not alone. He is now part of a list that has been growing for years across completely different parts of Harry's life, and the consistency of the pattern is what stops this from looking like a series of random individual fallouts.
Are the common denominator with all of it. They are hard to work for, they're hard to work alongside, they seem to be hard to retain any sort of friendship.
When the same outcome repeats across enough different contexts – family, military, school, celebrity, professional – the question of what connects all those outcomes stops being one anyone can comfortably avoid. King Charles, Prince William, former military friends, men who served beside Harry, who understood parts of his experience that the civilian world never could, and who represented a bond built on something more durable than celebrity or title. Friends from Eton who knew him before any of it mattered publicly. The royal butler who knew Harry during earlier years and later described him publicly as almost unrecognizable compared to the man he used to be. Close friends from before the royal departure who reportedly found that once the move to California happened, the connection quietly went with it. One by one, and from completely different directions, those relationships appear to have faded or ended, and the specific detail that commentators keep returning to is not the departures themselves. People in high-pressure lives lose touch all the time. What they note is the patience that preceded each departure. These were not people who walked away quickly. They stayed loyal for years. They made excuses. They kept trying. They held on to the version of Harry they had known and waited for it to re-emerge through whatever was happening on the surface. The fact that so many people from such genuinely different parts of his life – military, family, school, royal household – eventually reach the same conclusion is what gives the pattern its weight. That is not coincidence. That is not bad luck. That is not a personality clash with the wrong subset of people. That is a structural observation about something consistent in how these relationships have unfolded, regardless of the specific context or the specific people involved. The celebrity world shows a similar picture, though the departures there carry a different character. Less about blood and history, more about calculated professional distance. Alison Boshoff laid out the growing list in striking and specific detail. Oprah Winfrey, the Clooneys, the Beckhams, Elton John, Serena Williams, Idris Elba. People connected to the Suits world. Different circles, different relationships, different contexts, but critics keep noting the same direction of travel. The Oprah situation is the most instructive because it involves someone who was so visibly central to the Sussex public story. She was at the wedding. She conducted the interview that generated 50 million viewers and changed the global conversation more significantly than any other single media event. She was, at that moment, the most powerful public endorsement available, but she did not choose Meghan's children's book for her book club. One of the most commercially significant things she could have done for a project Meghan publicly cared about. She has not publicly attached herself to the couple's subsequent projects in any meaningful way. Paula Froelich described the current dynamic with a precision that has stayed in circulation. Oprah keeps Harry and Meghan at a safe distance, close enough to stay connected to the story if something major develops, far enough away to avoid being pulled into the ongoing fallout. That is not a friendship. It is not a severance. It is a very specific professional calculation by someone who understands exactly how to manage proximity to a complicated story. The Clooneys were reportedly generous during the honeymoon period. Private jet use, Lake Como, visible warmth. They are now publicly and visibly closer to King Charles and the charitable circles around William and Catherine. David Beckham reportedly showed up for Harry at Invictus, traveled to the event, was there in person, made himself present, and according to multiple accounts, the warmth he expected to receive in return was not there. People close to Beckham noted that he did not forget how that visit felt. Since then, both David and Victoria have been publicly warmer toward the Wales family. Idris Elba DJ'd the wedding reception and has been publicly silent about the couple since. Serena Williams, once one of Meghan's most visible public defenders, has gone noticeably quiet. And then there was the television project. The production had significant Netflix backing and access to what should have been the most impressive celebrity network in the world. Oprah lives nearby in Montecito. The wedding guest list included some of the most famous people on Earth. And yet the most recognizable celebrity attached to the show was Chrissy Teigen. In an industry built entirely on networking and status signals, where a celebrity's involvement in a project communicates as much as any marketing campaign, many insiders did not read that casting result as bad luck or an oversight. They read it as Hollywood communicating something in the only language it reliably speaks, the language of who shows up and who does not. One Daily Mail insider delivered a quote that has stayed in the commentary: "Harry and Meghan never think it is them. When relationships break down or contacts go quiet, the explanation always points outward. There is always a structural reason that explains the pattern without requiring any internal examination." The phrase that critics keep reaching for is architects of their own demise, and it shifts the focus away from external villains and toward the choices that were made, the patterns that repeated, and the accumulated weight of those patterns over time. The reason that phrase has gained traction is not that it is cruel or reductive. It is that it captures something specific about the shape of this story. The Sussex narrative has consistently positioned the couple as reacting to a hostile external world. The institution, the press, the racism, the jealousy, the system. The critics' counter-narrative argues that the external world is not, in fact, the common denominator across all these departures. The common denominator is the two people at the center of all of them, the one constant across every context in which this same outcome has appeared. Tom Bauer has been the most persistent in documenting the wider pattern. He has described what he sees as a trail of damaged relationships stretching back before the royal years. A consistent dynamic in which connections are formed with warmth and purpose, and then left behind when the next chapter begins. He has raised the question that makes some people genuinely and specifically uncomfortable. At what point does Harry himself become another casualty of the same pattern he has been living inside, the person left behind, rather than the one doing the leaving? It is a question worth sitting with seriously, not as an attack, but as an honest observation about where the trajectory leads when you trace it across enough time and enough different relationships. What observers keep noting is that if the separation from royal life had been purely about palace politics and institutional pressure, the personal friendships should have survived. The men he served with in the military, who understood parts of his experience that no civilian could fully reach and who represented bonds built through shared hardship rather than shared status. The school friends who held no titles and no strategic value, who knew him before any of it mattered publicly. The people who simply cared about him as a person, with no agenda attached to the relationship. The fact that those connections appear to have faded too is what makes the picture harder to read as simply a reaction to the monarchy. If the institution were the source of the problem, removing yourself from the institution should have freed the personal relationships from whatever pressure was affecting them. It does not appear to have worked that way. And that specific observation, that the departures went further than the royal world, into the private and personal world too, is the one that commentators keep returning to when they try to explain why the pattern is being taken so seriously. Now let's talk about who Harry used to be, because the contrast matters and it is worth stating clearly and without caricature. Harry had something that most public figures never quite manage to achieve, regardless of how famous they become or how hard they try. He had a genuine quality of warmth, the ability to be royal while still feeling completely human. Whether he was at a military base, in a children's hospital, walking into a public event with thousands of people watching, he could make people feel personally noticed. Not just acknowledged by a famous person, but actually seen. That is a rare and specific gift, and it cannot be manufactured. People did not just admire him because of the title or the story or the connection to Diana. They genuinely liked him. The affection was freely given and largely unconditional for a sustained period. The younger Harry, Diana's warmth combined with his own irreverence and natural humor, produced a quality of public goodwill that most public figures spend entire careers trying to build and never quite manage. It was organic, it was real, and it translated into genuine loyalty from people in completely different parts of his life, which is why the subsequent departures carry the weight they do. You cannot dismiss a growing list of departures from someone's life if the starting point was that those people genuinely and freely wanted to be there. The departures are significant precisely because the arrivals were real. The man that commentators are describing in 2026 is, by multiple accounts from people who knew the earlier version, a different experience. The legal battles against the British press, which have consumed years of his public life, the repeated public characterization of his family as villains in a story about his own suffering, the interview register that former butler Grant Harold and others have described as rehearsed and therapeutic in a way that replaces rather than expresses a natural voice, borrowed language sitting where a real one used to be. Rob Shuter has made the hardest version of this argument. Harry carries deep anger toward his family and appears determined to damage them publicly. And in Shuter's assessment, he understands exactly what he is doing while doing it. That assessment, if accurate, removes the softer and more sympathetic reading that Harry is simply lost or confused or a victim of circumstances beyond his control. It implies something more deliberate. Whether that reading is correct, the audience can weigh for themselves. But it is the reading that a growing number of commentators have been arriving at independently. What observers keep noting is that if the separation from royal life had been purely about palace politics and institutional pressure, the personal friendships, the men he served with, the school friends who held no titles and no strategic value, the people who simply cared about him, should have survived. The fact that those connections appear to have faded too is what makes the picture harder to read as simply a reaction to the monarchy. Peter Phillips knew Harry before any of this. He knew him when they were both young, when Harry was still the version of himself that generated so much natural public warmth, when the connection between them was built on family history and genuine shared experience rather than on crisis management or media positioning. He knew the Harry who walked beside him at funerals and showed up at difficult family moments, not because a communications team suggested it, but because that was simply who he was. And many believe he eventually reached the same conclusion that others reached before him, from completely different directions and through completely different relationships. The person appearing publicly today does not feel like the same person he grew up beside. That conclusion is not made lightly by someone with Peter Phillips' character and documented track record of loyalty. It is the conclusion of someone who tried, waited, and eventually had to accept what the evidence in front of him was consistently saying. It is the conclusion of someone who tried, waited, and eventually had to accept what the evidence in front of him was saying. No explosive public statement, no emotional interview, just 2 words in a magazine, and 2 words delivered in that register, by that person, in that context, say considerably more than a press release ever could. While all of this has been unfolding, the royal family has been doing what it has always done during periods of pressure, moving forward with visible discipline and without making the moving forward the story. William and Catherine are carrying stronger public support than at almost any previous point in their time as a couple. Catherine's return to public duties after a deeply difficult and intensely scrutinized personal period has generated genuine warmth from the public that no amount of brand management could manufacture and no amount of strategic positioning could replicate. The response was organic, the same quality that Harry himself once had in such abundance and that commentators are now consistently noting is absent from the version of him that appears in public and in interviews today. Charles is continuing to carry out his duties with the discipline of someone who understands what the role requires. Despite years of headlines, controversies, and family complications that would have broken institutions with less structural resilience, the monarchy is not collapsing. By most serious measures, it is functioning and in some respects thriving, not through dramatic gestures or media strategy, but through the patient and consistent accumulation of showing up. The contrast with the Sussex narrative is visible and has been noted by commentators across the spectrum. One side generates a constant cycle of controversy, litigation, commercial launches, and interview cycles in which the family's failings are the recurring subject. The other side shows up at state visits, at hospital wards, at military commemorations, at family weddings, and then goes home without making the showing up into a brand moment. That distinction has become one of the clearest and most consistent ways the public and the media appear to be reading the difference between the two narratives in 2026. Peter Phillips' wedding in the Cotswolds this summer will be attended by the people who have stayed through everything. The titles, the controversies, the years of complicated headlines, the moments of tension. William and Catherine are expected to be there. Charles and Camilla have been informed. It will be private, personal, and surrounded by the kind of genuine warmth that Peter has always valued. Not curated, not positioned for an audience. Just the people who have shown up consistently across a long period of time without requiring the showing up to be documented, distributed, and turned into a brand moment. Harry will not be there. And for the people who have been watching this story across many years, the absence will not feel like a dramatic rupture or a sharp break. It will feel like the quiet continuation of a process that has been underway for some time. The slow accumulation of distance that eventually becomes permanent, not through any single dramatic decision, but through the weight of many smaller ones. Lost touch. 2 words, restrained and precise, carrying the specific meaning that the people who understand this world immediately recognized. The royal world rarely needs to say things directly. The message is in the understatement, the distance, the carefully chosen phrase that says everything by appearing to say very little. In ordinary language, lost touch is something that happens passively, drifting apart, busy lives, time slipping away. In the context of a cousin's wedding, in the context of the history between these two people, in the context of the documented pattern surrounding Harry in 2026, those 2 words are not passive. They are a considered statement from a considered man, and they land with the weight of everything that preceded them. What those 2 words say, when you understand who said them and in what context and with what history behind them, is that a door which was once always open has, after years of patience, genuine effort, and the slow and quiet running out of both, finally closed. Not with drama, not with a statement, not with the kind of public rupture the Sussex story has generated so many times, just with the specific and deliberate finality of 2 words chosen by a man who means what he says and understood exactly what those words would communicate. Is there a path back for Harry from where things currently stand? Or has the accumulation of departures across enough different parts of his life now reached a point where the distance has become structural rather than circumstantial? The people who have left have not announced themselves as having left. They have simply gone quiet, gone distant, or delivered 2 words through a magazine. That specific kind of departure, without drama, without a public statement, without requiring any acknowledgement from either side, is in many ways the most final kind there is. It does not give the person at the center of the pattern anything to respond to, address, or contest. It simply closes, quietly and without noise, in the way things tend to close when the closing has been a long time in arriving. Leave your honest take in the comments below. Hit subscribe so you never miss what we cover next on Palace Insider. And if this kind of analysis is the reason you watch, the like button is how we reach more people who want exactly this. See you in the next one.